So today's main topic is about building a resilient weekly game. There have been we had a really good conversation over on the Sly Flourish Discord server, also available to patrons of Sly Flourish. And I also saw an interesting post over on EN World that talked about like whether or not role-playing games are a good hobby or not. And it got into this topic, and one of our members brought up the whole topic of like, is the RPG hobby a heartbreaker hobby? And this is something I want to dive into a little bit more. And by like, what does it mean to be a heartbreaker hobby? And where did the EN World thread where I was reading about it and the conversation kind of went was, are there general expectations about what this hobby is going to be like that end up not getting met? And for some, that is absolutely true. I think that there are definitely times where like our impression of the way the hobby is going to be when we get into it is different than it actually ends up. And like a common way is many new GMs go in thinking, if I spend a lot of time building out a really big world and a really big story with lots of interesting details and gewgaws and doodads and lots of rich history and lots of, current events, that my players are going to flow right into that and it's going to be brilliant. And then the players like, we don't actually care about any of that. We just want to go on adventures and do stuff. And that sort of heartbreak, I think, happens pretty frequently. And it's a good sign of like a sophomore game master to recognize, wait a minute, my players are going to care about the things my players are going to care about, not necessarily the things that I care about. And I need to figure out how to come to grips with that and how to build that. And some GMs never come to grips with that. They always keep doubling down on their story. But you will hear me talk about spiral campaign development. I've heard other GMs that I've talked to where they talk about spiral campaign development, and the GM, the Dungeon Master's Guide talks about this. Like it's described in many, many different places. Focus on the characters first and build the world outwards. Like not as the only style, but as certainly one style. And for me, the style I will recommend. And I think you're going to have a lot less heartbreak if you build your campaign around the characters that the players bring to the table, while at the same time working with the players to build characters around the kind of campaign you want to run. If you do those two things, you are kind of setting better expectations for both you and your players and how that's going to work. But another big piece of heartbreak is even getting the group together in the first place. I have said since probably the beginning of the times that I've been offering any kind of advice on game mastering that the hardest part of this hobby is finding players. Finding and building a resilient group is really, really hard. And it's something that I have spent a lot of time on. We're going to talk a little bit more about that today in three main topics. One, finding a group. How do you find them? Particularly, how do you find an in-person group? I'm not going to talk so much about finding an online group, not because I don't think that's valid. I totally think that that's a valid way to play, but I've been focusing a little bit more on like, what would it take to find people to play in person? How to build a resilient group so that once you have the right players, how do you keep the game going? How do you run as many games as possible and cancel as infrequently as possible? And then how do you build your game itself, the structure of the kind of game you run? How do you build that with some flexibility to make sure that you can play as much as you can? So those are three things that we're going to talk about. So on the topic of like finding a group, I have written articles. You will find a link in the show notes to articles on Sly Flourish about how people find a group, but I haven't really looked into it recently. So I posted a recent poll over, not a poll, but like a comment over on YouTube where I tend to get like, 100-ish people that will answer on where they found in-person groups. And again, I'm focusing on in-person. Another time we'll talk about how to find people for online groups, but how do you just get people back? And the results that came back were mostly from these following categories. Friendly local game shops had 16 people mention that. I don't know that these numbers are 100% either, but a lot of people said finding groups in local game shops is one way to find a group. Facebook groups was also highly mentioned. Friends and family, another constant. Local libraries is a real good one. Community events like local game days or conventions that are happening in your area. Work colleagues. This one has worked a lot for me. I recruited a lot of my players, both from people that I worked with and also friends of people that I worked with. Reddit and Discord, other social media, organized play sessions, which kind of gets into your local game stores, and local gaming clubs, which may or may not be stores. So those were the common ways that people found it. I recall that sites like meetup.com were a way that you could sort of go and find people in the local area that wanted to go there. There's a social media site called Nextdoor that is really focused around regional stuff, like who are the people around your area. A lot of of time it's like, hey, look, there's a strange person hanging out in my street. I should call the police. But sometimes you could actually post a post there and be like, hey, I'm looking to get a local game group together. Is anybody interested? I don't have any proof that works, but it seems like a possible avenue for finding local players. But it sounds like if you can find a local game shop, if you can go to your local library, right now is a really good time because D&D is way more popular than it's ever been. And so you're more likely to find people that at least know what it is and maybe are willing to try it out. Friends and family is always a good one. Trying out, going to like finding various Facebook groups, and then look in other social media sites for areas where you can and ask around like, hey, where can I find players in my area to play? And you might find them there. So those are kind of common ways to find them. But once you've got, and then there's a whole process of figuring out, are the players that I have found the right players for my game? That's another big topic. I have another article on Sly Flourish where I talk about like how you can kind of interview players, how you can make it clear to them what kind of game you want to run, how you can talk to them to learn what kind of games they want to play in. And then I would highly recommend that once you've found people to play, talk to them independently, go meet with them, go to a coffee shop, spend an hour talking with them. Hopefully, if they're not willing to sit down with you and spend an hour chatting about it, they might not be committed enough to join the game in general. And during that conversation, you can ask them, hey, tell me about your game, what kind of games you played in, what kind of background do you have? And generally, you'll get a feeling for them during that kind of hour-long talk to see, like, is this somebody that I would want to have at my table playing in the game? Then your next layer is run a one-shot game. Don't schedule it at the time you're planning to run a game in general, or if you do, don't tell them that that's your regular planned game. And instead, invite them to a single session and have them play in a game and see how they are. That way you get an idea. Are they a power gamer in a game where I don't really want a power gamer? Or are they creepy in other ways? Like, what are things you can do that you can kind of determine, okay, yeah, I think this will be somebody good. And then eventually, once you have that, then you can kind of build your gaming group. This is all pretty hard. When they talk about like RPGs being a heartbreaker hobby, this is kind of the example of like, it's way harder to do this than it is to like whip up a group in Destiny to go on a mission while you're playing an online game. But it can be important in order to have that group. And trust me, once you have it, it's really, really rewarding. So then once you've found your group and you've got your players together, how do you make sure that you can play as often as possible? And I have two approaches for this. One is, I've described this before, both on this show and in other articles, about what I call the 6+2 group. And the idea is you try to build up a group where you have 6 full-time players that are committed to coming regularly. And then you have 2 people who are interested enough that they'd be willing to drop in from the game from time to time. So 2 people that you can call on to say, hey, I have a seat free. Would you be interested in playing? A lot of people say like, well, doesn't that suck for them? And it can if their intention is to be a full-time player. But some people, they already know their schedule is not going to be totally flexible and that they won't be able to play, or they just want to kind of dive in from time to time. They could be a friend of a friend. They could be somebody's spouse. They could be somebody's partner. And they say, oh, we'd love to have you sit in. We can't necessarily have you sit in all the time. For me, like, for example, I have one friend and his daughter will jump in the game when we have a free slot. So that can work out. So when you come up with a way to have some players who are like, some people are fine having the flexibility to only be coming every so often, that can still work for them. And you want to have those people on hand so you have somebody you can call when you have a seat free. And then you try to have 6 people who you think can make it regularly. So here's the interesting way you run it. All you need to actually run a game is 4 people, right? And I've heard some GMs that say we sometimes will run with 3. So if you can figure out how to build your game so that running with 4 people is possible, that means it takes 5 people canceling before you can't run a game. Because if 4 people cancel, if you have both your on-call people can't make it, and 2 of your regulars can't make it, that's 4 people, and you can still run it. It would take 5 people canceling before you can't run a game. That means that you're going to be running that game a lot more often than you won't be, unless everybody's flaking out all the time, which could happen. Again, like not everything is perfect. But I found that to work really well. And that means that I have very rarely canceled a game. In fact, about the only times I cancel a game is when I myself can't make it. I become the bottleneck because I have an issue that means I can't cancel. So a DM canceling is a big deal. But when you can design it so that up to 4 people can play, that means, and you have a 6+2 group, that means it takes 5 people canceling before the game doesn't happen. But you also have to design the game to be flexible for that, because a lot of people say, well, our stories are so tightly wound around the characters that if a particular character doesn't show up, that means the game can't go on. And that, if you want to build a system, if you want to build a group where you play more often than you don't, and that has that kind of flexibility, you can't build your system around that idea that if one player can't show up, the game can't go on. And that means you can't have these truly like deep character-focused games where the whole reason that this game is taking place is because of this one particular character. Instead, what you can do is treat the group as an abstract entity. It doesn't matter who's in the group, but the group itself is almost like an uber character. And the game is revolving around the actions and directions and focus of the group, not so much the character. And a way to think about this is like 1980s serial TV shows. I was talking about this with my wife, and it's like Knight Rider. If you watch the show Knight Rider or The A-Team or Walker, Texas Ranger or these other shows, you can almost play them completely out of order and they still work. It means that each session of your game needs to be its own cohesive arc. And this is why the whole idea of West Marches games are so popular. That with like a West Marches game, you have this idea that the players are the ones who bring the story to the GM, and the GM runs it for that particular group. And then the next week, a different group or a different set of players might show up with a different mission. And one of the reasons why that works is because you have this flexibility that the group that comes to the table is the group that's going to have a particular scenario. And another group that shows up is going to have a different one. So if you're building your campaign so that it's not necessarily, if you really need a robust campaign, a really resilient campaign where you're going to have players shifting in and out and you're worried about the story, instead try to make sure that the story focuses within one session. And it doesn't have to be perfect. You could still have an overarching story that everybody can kind of keep track of. But the individual adventures are not so tightly wound that if a player misses a session or two, they can come back and pick it right back up. And you want it to be the same way that if they miss a couple episodes of Knight Rider, they can still come back and pick it right back up. They still know who Kit is. They still know Michael Knight is. They still know why, whatever is going on in Devon and the truck and all that stuff, car, right? You have all that stuff that people, you can still pick it up. And that's why like summaries are important. You might have a player, I've had players who are out for a month. And they come back and they say, okay, here is the quick summary of what happened in the past month. And they fall back in line. And I'll tell you, I've been running this style now for almost 20. I've been running it for like 16 or 17 years. We've had this kind of flexible game well before 5th edition. And I haven't had complaints. Like I've been having a lot of fun. My players have been having a lot of fun. There are times where things kind of fall off a little bit. There are probably occasions where players miss a session that they were really looking forward to because it had something that they were interested in particular, but because of life circumstances, they couldn't make it and we didn't hold and wait for them. But the reality is we've gotten to play a whole lot of games. We very rarely cancel a game, and it happens a lot. So I think when we think about like what the ideal is, and I think this is where this like RPG heartbreaker problem comes from, is all right, in ideal circumstances, we'd always have everybody at the table. We would have character-driven stories that are really deep and nobody would ever miss them. But the reality is life is busy and people are busy and people don't show up and people have real-life things going on. And if we want to keep playing, we have to build a game that's more resilient for that kind of flexibility. We need flexible games that can withstand it. And that means sometimes that the characters aren't quite as driven around a story or that a player is going to miss a particular session that they might have been looking forward to. But the game rolls on. And so I think that in the same way that we think about building our game worlds to support the characters, we need to build our groups to support real life because real life is complicated and has circumstances that come up where people can't make it. And we try to roll anyway. So those are some thoughts that I have about trying to build a resilient weekly game. I hope you found that useful. And I hope that by kind of either grabbing onto some of these ideas, or maybe you have other ideas on how to keep your game rolling all the time, how you manage to get as many sessions in as you can. And if you do, please leave a comment. And I definitely want to hear more about it. If you like the show and you want more stuff like this, please subscribe to the Sly Flourish newsletter. It is absolutely free to sign up. You can find a link in the show notes. You get a free adventure generator PDF, and you get a weekly article about this fantastic hobby of ours with links to all of the other stuff that I do all across the internet. You can also support me directly on Patreon. You get access to things like the 5e Artisanal Monster Database, the virtual tabletops from the Dwarven Forge virtual tabletops, all kinds of stuff you get for being a patron, but you also get access to the awesome Lazy GM community where we talk about topics like this all throughout the week, and you help me put on shows like this. And you can also pick up any of my books, including Return of the Lazy Dungeon Master, the Lazy DM Workbook, Lazy DM's Companion, which is packed with random tables that you can use to help shake up your brain and come up with interesting ideas for your adventures, and many, many more on the Sly Flourish Bookstore. Thank you all so much. Have a great day, and get out there and play an RPG.